Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material. So I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine spending years, I mean, maybe even decades, just dreaming of returning to your homeland.
Yeah, just completely idealized in your head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you finally get there. And against literally all odds, you spend weeks doing this just back-breaking labor to build a massive, impenetrable stone fortress around your entire city.
Just brutal physical work.
Right. You set these heavy wooden doors in the gates, you drop the iron bars into place, and you stand back, wiping the sweat from your forehead, and you just feel this sense of absolute triumph.
You finally did it. You're safe.
Right. But then you turn around and you look inside the walls. And you realize you are standing inside a ghost town.
Oh, man.
Like, there are no people. There's no economy. There are no homes. It's just you.
These completely empty streets, a landscape of rubble, and, highly hostile neighbors waiting just outside those newly built gates.
It's terrifying, honestly.
It really is. And that is exactly where we find the ancient Jewish people in the text that we're doing a deep dive into today.
Yeah, that image really captures the sheer gravity and the profound anxiety of this historical moment, because to properly orient ourselves for this deep dive into Nehemiah chapter 7 through 10, we really have to look at the geopolitical reality of the year 445 BC.
Right. The context here is everything.
It absolutely is. So the Jewish people have returned to Jerusalem from this devastating multi-generational exile in Babylon. I mean, they're no longer a sovereign nation at all.
They're basically subjects, right?
Exactly. They're this deeply marginalized community living as vassals under the thumb of the massive Persian Empire, which is ruled by King Artaxerxes. And Nehemiah, their leader, has just achieved this monumental administrative and physical feat of rebuilding the city's exterior walls.
Which is huge.
It's incredible. But, a wall is just a perimeter. It doesn't generate life. The city is geographically large, but it is just dangerously depopulated.
Yeah, which brings us to the core mission of our deep dive today, because we're acting as your guides, to help you extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and really the real-world application from this ancient historical record.
Right, because it's not just a history lesson.
Exactly. No. And this specific section of the text reveals a truth that is universally applicable, whether you're looking at an ancient civilization or your own modern life. And that truth is, rebuilding the physical structures of our lives is really only step one.
Just the beginning.
Yeah. True restoration requires rebuilding our internal identity, our understanding of truth, and our commitments to one another. So let's unpack this. We're shifting from the triumph of completing a physical construction project to the immediate, somewhat terrifying problem of establishing inner security in just a total vacuum.
Yeah, and Nehemiah chapter 7 opens right at this precarious pivot point, The physical barrier is up, but the vacuum remains. Verse 1 basically says, "Now when the wall was built and I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites were appointed."
Wait, okay, I have to jump in here.
Go for it.
The list of people he appoints is genuinely surprising if you think about it from a purely tactical standpoint.
Gatekeepers, sure. That makes total sense. You build a gate, you need a guy with a spear standing in front of it.
Obviously.
But singers, Levites. I mean, the Levites were the priests and the temple workers. You don't usually put the choir and the clergy on the front lines of your municipal defense strategy, right? Especially when you're surrounded by hostile foreign powers.
Right. It seems entirely counterintuitive to a modern secular way of thinking about municipal security. We think strictly in terms of force projection and physical deterrence.
Yeah, weapons and guards. Exactly. But the historical commentator Matthew Henry makes a really brilliant observation about this ancient mindset. He notes that God's worship is the actual defense of a place.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The Levites and the singers attending to the temple service were viewed as being just as crucial to the security of the city as the military guards. Henry writes that dead walls without living watchmen are but a poor defense to a city.
Dead walls without living watchmen. That imagery is incredibly vivid.
It really sticks with you.
It does. Because you can construct the most formidable stone perimeter in the world, complete with the latest technology or the thickest iron. But if the people standing on that wall are asleep or morally corrupt or they just have no sense of collective purpose, I mean, that wall is entirely useless. It's just a monument to a dead society.
Yeah, security is never just a physical barrier. It's a state of constant vigilance, and it relies entirely on the life, the spirit, and the integrity of the people manning the barrier.
Which Nehemiah clearly understood.
He understood it intuitively, which is why his very next administrative move is to appoint leadership over the city. He doesn't just, leave it to chance or let whoever wants the job take it. He puts two specific men in charge, his brother Hanani and a man named Hananiah, who carries the title of the governor of the fortress.
And the text gives us the specific reason why he chooses Hananiah. And it's a fascinating look at ancient leadership metrics.
Oh, it's so different from today.
Totally. It doesn't say he chose him because he had a prestigious degree in urban planning, or because he was this battlefield hero with the highest kill count, or even because he was a slick political tactician who could negotiate with the Persians.
None of that.
Right. The text explicitly says he put Hananiah in charge, quote, "For he was a faithful man and feared God above many."
Yeah, Nehemiah is demonstrating a timeless principle there. Competence alone is a completely insufficient metric for leadership, particularly in a fragile rebuilding phase of a society.
You need something deeper.
Exactly. He elevates Hananiah based purely on character. When we look at Matthew Henry's analysis of this, he notes that among those who claim to revere God, there are some who deeply excel others in the actual daily expressions of that reverence.
Right. It's not just talk for Hananiah.
Right. He was universally conscientious. Because when your community is vastly outnumbered, economically depressed, and highly vulnerable, you really cannot afford a leader who might take a bribe from a neighboring warlord.
Oh, for sure. That would be catastrophic.
Exactly. You need leaders whose integrity is an unshakable foundation.
And in addition to appointing that high-character leadership, Nehemiah institutes some incredibly strict, highly specific operational rules for the city, right? Like, he tells his new governors, don't let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot.
Yeah, which is fascinating.
Now, if you look at how scholars like Albert Barnes view this, that was a highly unusual precaution for a city in the ancient Near East.
Oh, completely. The standard practice in the ancient world was to open town gates right at the break of dawn. I mean, merchants want to trade, farmers need to get to their fields outside the walls, and the local economy totally relies on that early morning movement.
Right, dawn is when the ancient world wakes up and gets to work.
Exactly. But Nehemiah dictates a massive disruption to that norm. He insists the gates remain barred until the sun is high in the sky. He wants to ensure that every single guard is fully awake, the shadows where assassins or spies might hide have completely burned off, and the city is at maximum operational readiness before anyone is allowed in or out.
He takes it a step further, too, by appointing watches from the actual inhabitants of Jerusalem. And he strategically places them to guard the area right in front of their own houses.
Which is brilliant.
It's a masterful delegation of responsibility. I mean, you are naturally going to be infinitely more vigilant, your eyes are going to be sharper, and your grip on your weapon will be tighter when you know your own children are sleeping just a few feet behind the wall you're guarding.
Oh, absolutely. It forces personal investment in the collective security. But, even with the gates secure and the guards in place, the physical reality of the city remains really grim.
Right. Which brings us to a moment in the text that honestly feels like a massive grinding speed bump to the narrative momentum.
It really does.
The walls are done, the gates are locked, but the city itself is an empty shell. Verse 4 paints the picture clearly. It says, "Now the city was wide and large, but the people were few therein, and the houses were not built."
Just an empty expanse.
Let's pause and visualize this. There are no houses. The infrastructure is non-existent. The city is essentially a giant, empty courtyard. And what does Nehemiah do in the face of this urgent housing and population crisis?
He does the last thing you'd expect.
Right. He decides to sit down and read a dusty, decades-old list of thousands of names. The text says God prompted him to uncover the genealogical register of the first wave of exiles who had returned under a leader named Zerubbabel nearly a century earlier.
Yeah, out of nowhere.
So we are suddenly confronted with this massive, tedious census, 42,360 people, plus over 7,000 servants. And I really have to push back on this. Because if I'm a refugee standing in the rubble and my leader stops everything to read a phone book of dead ancestors, I'm furious.
Yeah, you'd be like, what are we doing right now?
Exactly. Why stop the critical momentum of rebuilding to read a census?
Well, It is a completely fair critique, and reading through Chapter 7 can feel incredibly tedious to a modern reader who just wants to get to the action. But we really have to look at the deep psychological utility of this moment.
Okay, lay it on me.
So on a purely administrative level, yes, to safely populate this massive city, Nehemiah needed a secure vetting process. He needed to identify which families historically belonged to Jerusalem so he could systematically ask them to move back inside the walls from the surrounding agrarian villages.
Sure, practically that makes sense.
But the administrative function is really secondary here. Reviewing these genealogies was fundamentally an exercise in recovering a deeply fractured identity.
But, I mean, if I'm a refugee whose family has been living in Babylon for 3 generations, reading my great-grandfather's name on a piece of parchment doesn't put a roof over my head or feed my kids today. How does reciting ancestry actually help a starving, vulnerable community?
We have to consider the trauma of exile and what it does to a population's collective memory. These people have suffered from generational amnesia.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. They were born in a foreign empire. They grew up speaking a foreign language, serving foreign kings, and being told by the dominant Babylonian and Persian cultures that their god was defeated and their history was just irrelevant.
Right, they've been totally assimilated, whether they want it to be or not.
Exactly. And now they arrive in Jerusalem, and it's just dirt and broken rocks. They have absolutely no physical connection to this space. Matthew Henry points out that it was of vital use to compare what they had been with what they now were, to trace their small beginnings. When Nehemiah stands up and reads the names of the children of Peresh, the children of Shephatiah, the children of Era, he is doing profound psychological work.
He's anchoring them.
Yes. He is anchoring a traumatized, scattered people to their shared roots.
He is giving them a narrative. He's basically looking at a crowd of exhausted people holding trowels and swords and saying, you are not just random displaced refugees trying to survive another day. You are part of an unbroken lineage. You have a story that predates the empire that enslaved you. This dirt belongs to your story.
That's exactly it. Furthermore, Henry notes a really beautiful theological point embedded in this dry list. The repetition of these long, specific lists of families demonstrates the meticulous delight God takes in the persons and families of his people.
He knows them specifically.
Right. He knows them by name. He has his eye on the register. Reading those names aloud in the empty city was a way of reestablishing their historical reality and their specific covenant with God before they attempted to take another step forward in their physical rebuilding.
And this translates so seamlessly to our 21st century realities. Let's look at how this applies to the modern listener. Because when you go through a major life-altering crisis, perhaps it's a catastrophic career failure, a sudden and terrifying health diagnosis, or, a deeply painful relational breakdown, your immediate survival instinct is to rebuild the walls.
Always. You go right into defense mode.
Right. You rush to establish external boundaries, you change your phone number, you switch departments at work, you block people on social media, you set up rigid, defensive schedules to protect your time and energy.
And those defensive boundaries are absolutely necessary, just as Nehemiah's physical wall of stone was necessary to keep the surrounding warlords at bay.
But the tragedy is that we almost always stop there. We build the wall and we neglect the watchman.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge trap.
It is. We stop paying attention to what we are passively letting into our own minds and hearts once that external boundary is up. And even worse, we neglect our own genealogy, meaning we forget to remember our core values and who we fundamentally are outside of the crisis.
We just lose ourselves in the survival of it all.
Exactly. We become so consumed by the sheer, exhausting mechanics of surviving and maintaining our defensive walls that we lose our actual identity. We become a ghost town on the inside.
This brings up a critical point of reflection for you, the listener. If you find yourself in a season of intense rebuilding right now, take a hard look at your perimeter. Who or what are the watchmen standing guard over your mental and emotional life?
That's such a good question.
Right. Are you successfully keeping out external threats, only to allow internal enemies like pervasive anxiety, deep-seated cynicism, or bitterness to just walk right through the gates you spent months building? And on a deeper level, do you still know who you are, completely independent of the trauma you just survived?
Yeah. So we want to offer you a highly practical exercise based on this ancient census. Sometime this week, sit down and do a personal identity audit.
I love that idea.
Take a physical piece of paper and write down your genealogy. Write out the core values, the foundational beliefs, and the communities or the roots that you truly belong to. Document the things that make you uniquely you, completely separate from your current struggles or your career title.
You really have to get it on paper.
You do.
Yeah.
You have to ensure that you don't lose your soul in the mechanics of just keeping the wall standing. Because once Nehemiah secured that perimeter and established the identity of the people, the community was ready for the next phase. And the fascinating thing is, this next phase wasn't initiated by the government, and it wasn't built with bricks. It was built with a book.
Right. And this transition leads us directly into Chapter 8, which provides one of the most vivid, emotionally charged, and structurally significant scenes in the entire historical record of this era.
It's an incredible scene.
It really is. It is the first day of the 7th month. The grueling physical labor has paused. The text tells us that all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the broad public square before the water gate. And notice the agency here. They do not wait for Nehemiah or the leadership to dictate the agenda.
They don't wait for permission.
No. The people themselves approach Ezra the scribe and specifically ask him to bring the book of the law of Moses.
The people were starving for the truth. Nehemiah didn't have to mandate a citywide assembly. He didn't issue a decree forcing them to listen to a religious lecture. The hunger was entirely grassroots.
That organic, desperate hunger is really the defining characteristic of this moment. Ezra responds by bringing the law before the entire congregation, men, women, and anyone who had the cognitive ability to hear with understanding. He climbs onto a large wooden pulpit that had been constructed specifically for this massive public reading.
And the response is just immediate.
Right. The moment he simply opens the book, the entire crowd of thousands stands up in unified respect. Ezra blesses God. The people respond with a booming amen, amen, lifting their hands to the sky, and then they bow with their faces completely to the ground in worship.
You can almost feel the sheer, heavy reverence of that moment vibrating off the page. And Ezra proceeds to read the text aloud from early morning until midday.
Which is an incredibly long time.
Yeah, we're talking about 5 or 6 hours of standing and listening. But the most critical operational detail in this scene is found in verse 8. It says, they read in the book, in the law of God distinctly, and gave the sense, and caused them to understand the reading. So the Levites weren't just standing on a stage, right?
Yeah.
They were actively mingling throughout this massive crowd, serving as on-the-fly translators and expositors.
Yeah, and we have to explore the linguistic mechanics of why this was so necessary. Both Barnes and Henry highlight that mere recitation of the text would have been completely ineffective.
Why is that?
Well, we have to remember the 70 years of Babylonian exile. Language degrades and shifts rapidly when a population is conquered and dispersed. Over multiple generations, the Jewish people had largely adopted Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the empire, as their daily spoken language.
Oh, right. So they weren't even speaking Hebrew anymore.
Exactly. Many of them, especially the younger generations born in exile, likely could not fluently understand the ancient classical Hebrew in which the original texts of Moses were written.
It would be like trying to read a highly complex legal document written in 14th century Middle English to a crowd of modern teenagers.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah, they might catch a few words, but the profound nuance and the actual legal requirements would just go right over their heads.
Precisely. The Levites were performing an incredibly complex intellectual task. They were taking the classical Hebrew, translating it into the local Aramaic dialect in real time, and then giving the sense meaning. They were explaining the theological and practical implications of the text. Henry writes, reading is good and preaching good, but expounding brings the reading and the preaching together and thus makes the reading the more intelligible.
So it's about real comprehension.
Yes. Understanding, not just hearing, is the actual catalyst for human change.
So this massive crowd finally understands the ancient text. The linguistic barrier is broken. They comprehend exactly what the law says and the high moral standard it demands of them. And what is their immediate, visceral reaction?
Intense.
Yeah, they begin to weep. The text says all the people wept intensely when they heard the words of the law.
The law essentially acts as an unyielding mirror. For the first time in their lives, they are looking at a clear, uncorrupted reflection of the standard God had set for their society.
And they don't like what they see.
No, because simultaneously, they are seeing exactly how far they and their ancestors have fallen from that standard. As Barnes notes, the exposition of the law brings vividly before their minds their historical sins of both omission and commission. They're just overwhelmed by the sudden realization of their collective failure.
You know, I think this is a moment where a modern listener might feel a strong urge to reject the text.
Oh, absolutely.
Because in our contemporary culture, we tend to view anything that intentionally induces feelings of guilt, shame, or deep mourning as inherently toxic or psychologically oppressive.
You really do. We run from it.
We do. We look at an ancient narrative describing thousands of people wailing and weeping over a religious text, and our modern reflex is to think, wow, that is incredibly manipulative. That's an unhealthy environment.
It's a completely natural modern reaction because we're heavily conditioned by our culture to avoid negative emotions at all costs. We view emotional discomfort as an error state that needs to be immediately medicated or distracted away rather than a diagnostic tool.
Yeah, let's look at a modern analogy to kind of demystify what's happening here. Imagine you have a mountain of credit card debt. You know things are bad, but for years you have been actively ignoring the envelopes that come in the mail.
Oh, I know that feeling. Just putting them in a drawer.
Exactly. You refuse to log into your banking app. You are living in a state of willful, comfortable ignorance. But one day, you finally sit down, open the statements, and look at the itemized list of your compounding interest and your massive liabilities.
The reckoning.
The reckoning. And the sheer reality of the numbers makes you want to put your head on the desk and cry. But the bank statement isn't toxic. The math isn't oppressive. It is simply telling you the objective truth about your financial reality.
Right, it's just data.
Yes. The tears are a completely natural, necessary, and healthy response to the shock of finally facing the truth after years of delusion.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanics of Chapter 8. The Book of the Law was their spiritual and societal bank statement. They were looking at the compounding interest of generations of moral compromise. But what makes this historical account so fascinating is the leadership's response.
This is the crazy part.
It really is. Nehemiah, Ezra, and the Levites do something completely countercultural, even to our modern sensibilities, where we sometimes encourage people to sit endlessly in their trauma. The leaders step in and actually command the people to stop weeping.
They completely shut the mourning down. Verse 9 says, "This day is holy unto the Lord your God, mourn not nor weep." And then Nehemiah delivers this incredible directive in verse 10. He says, "Go your way, eat the fat and drink the sweet, and send portions unto them for whom nothing is prepared. For the joy of the Lord is your strength."
Nehemiah and Ezra are demonstrating a profound grasp of human psychology here. They recognize that while the initial shock of guilt is a necessary wake-up call, like looking at that bank statement, guilt is a terrible, highly corrosive fuel for long-term human thriving.
It just eats you up.
Exactly. If you stay in the guilt, if you just sit at your desk and cry over the debt endlessly, you become entirely paralyzed. You will never summon the energy required to actually build a better financial future. Shame depletes you. It doesn't sustain you.
The joy of the Lord is your strength. They had a massive physical and societal rebuilding project ahead of them. You don't get the resilience to rebuild a broken world from wallowing in shame.
No, you definitely don't.
You get that strength from joy, from the sudden liberating realization that despite your massive failures, the debt isn't the end of the story. You're still loved, you're still drawing breath, and you are anchored to a God who provides a way forward.
And notice the brilliant practicality of how Nehemiah instructs them to access this joy. He doesn't offer a vague platitude, like, just choose to be happy.
Right, no toxic positivity.
No, he gives them highly specific physical actions to perform. Eat the fat, drink the sweet, and send portions to him for whom nothing is prepared. Henry points out that this mandate to share their rich food with the impoverished members of the community naturally grew out of the very law they were just weeping over.
Wow, that's beautiful.
It is. True, mature wisdom redirects the inward spiral of sorrow into an outward explosion of communal joy and immediate, tangible charity.
It's an incredible psychological hack. Instead of allowing the people to focus inward on their own misery and guilt, Nehemiah commands them to focus outward on the immediate physical needs of their neighbors.
It forces them out of their own heads.
Yeah. Going out of your way to package up a meal and hand it to someone who has absolutely nothing instantly breaks the paralyzing cycle of self-pity. You cannot remain trapped in your own shame when you're actively alleviating someone else's hunger.
This outward physical expression of abstract truths leads directly into a fascinating comparative insight we see on the second day of this gathering. The leaders of the families assemble again with Ezra to continue studying, and they uncover the ancient command regarding the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths.
Okay, tell us about this feast.
So the text required the Israelites to live in temporary, fragile shelters made of tree branches for 7 days in the seventh month. This was designed to force them to physically remember how their ancestors lived in vulnerable tents during their wilderness wanderings after being liberated from slavery in Egypt.
So the people immediately spring into action, right? They go out to the surrounding mountains, they cut down olive branches, pine branches, myrtle, and palm branches, and they literally construct these little leafy shacks on their flat roofs in their courtyards and in the public squares.
Yeah, Barnes observes that this specific immersive practice, actually dwelling in the booths, had largely fallen into abeyance since the distant days of Joshua. But this generation revives it with incredible enthusiasm.
Which is so striking.
It is, and the broader human connection we see here is vital. As human beings, we are deeply tactile creatures. We require physical, sensory rituals to anchor abstract, historical, or spiritual memories. We cannot merely think our way into remembering profound truths. We have to feel them.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah. We have to touch the rough bark, we have to smell the pine needles baking in the sun, we have to feel the wind blowing through a fragile shelter. We need physical markers like wearing a wedding ring or setting up a Christmas tree to continually remind our forgetful brains of our fragility and the realities we claim to value.
Which brings us to a set of powerful, practical questions for you as you listen to this deep dive. How do you process the hard, uncomfortable truths about your own failures?
That's a tough question to answer, honestly.
It really is. When you get a brutal performance review at work, or when a critical relationship breaks down entirely because of a selfish choice you made, do you stay stuck in the weaving phase? Do you let the shame wrap around you and paralyze your ability to change? Or do you possess the self-awareness to feel the sorrow and then pivot to constructive action and joy?
It requires deep wisdom and careful discernment to navigate that transition. Holy mourning certainly has its place. It is absolutely necessary to feel the genuine weight of our mistakes, to look at the bank statement without flinching.
Right, you can't just ignore it.
Exactly. But wallowing in the resulting shame is a trap that ultimately prevents restoration.
So here is a practical exercise for you to implement. The next time you are forced to face a harsh reality about your own character or your failures, intentionally pair your internal course correction with an external act of generosity.
I really love this practical application.
Yeah, if you realize you have been incredibly selfish with your time at home, don't just sit in the corner feeling guilty and miserable about it. Go out of your way to send a portion of your time to someone who desperately needs it. Shift your focus outward. Let the joy of serving someone else be the actual strength that fuels your personal change rather than relying on the toxic fuel of guilt.
Because, as the narrative demonstrates as we move into Chapter 9, joy is not the final destination either. The intense joy of the 7-day Festival of Booths was a necessary staging ground.
Oh, interesting. A staging ground for what?
Well, once the people were strengthened by that joy, once they were thoroughly convinced that they were secure in God's love and provision despite their history, they finally possessed the emotional fortitude to endure the deep, painful, surgical work of corporate confession. They needed the stabilizing force of joy first, so the weight of the confession wouldn't completely crush their newly formed identity.
Let's examine this shift because the contrast is staggering. We transition from a 7-day outdoor festival characterized by eating rich food, drinking sweet drinks, and celebrating in pine branch shelters directly into the 24th day of the month.
The whiplash is real.
It really is. Yeah. On this day, the text says the children of Israel assemble with fasting, dressed in rough sackcloth, with literal dirt thrown on their heads. They spend 3 entire hours, a full fourth of the daylight reading the law, and then another 3 hours intensely confessing and worshiping.
It is a massive, sweeping movement of national repentance, and the centerpiece of Chapter 9 is an incredible panoramic prayer led by the Levites. It is essentially a theological masterclass summarizing the entire history of the Israelite people.
It covers everything.
Yeah, it starts from the dawn of creation, moves to the calling of Abraham, details the brutal slavery in Egypt, the miraculous parting of the Red Sea, the terrifying giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and the decades of wandering in the wilderness sustained by manna and the pillar of cloud and fire.
Okay, I have to pause here because the psychology of this seems contradictory.
How so?
Well, why would they spend 3 grueling hours reciting a history of failure that they already intimately know? They literally just lived through the horrific consequences of that failure in the Babylonian exile. Does it standing in the dirt, reciting all the times their ancestors rebelled, just rub salt in the wound? I mean, we just spent the last 20 minutes talking about the importance of not wallowing in guilt and moving toward joy.
Yeah, it certainly has the appearance of wallowing, but the function of this prayer is entirely different. This is not about self-flagellation. This is about diagnosing a chronic generational disease.
Oh, I see.
The Levites are laying out the historical data to reveal a deeply ingrained destructive pattern in human nature. If you trace the narrative arc of this massive prayer, you see a specific cycle repeated over and over again. We can call it the historical doom loop.
Historical doom loop. I like that.
Let's break down the mechanics of this cycle. Step 1 is always God's provision and grace. God rescues them or gives them land.
Which naturally leads to step 2, prosperity. The people experience the benefits of that provision. Verse 25 captures it perfectly, stating they became fat and delighted themselves in thy great goodness. They have houses, vineyards, and safety.
But the danger always lurks in step 3. Prosperity inevitably breeds complacency and rebellion. Human nature struggles to handle sustained comfort.
We really do. We get comfortable and we get lazy.
Exactly. When you have everything you need, you slowly forget the dependency that brought you that success in the first place. You become arrogant. You cast the law behind your back.
And that arrogance triggers step 4, disaster. The protective grace is lifted, enemies invade, and the society collapses under the weight of its own corruption.
Which forces step 5. The people now in distress cry out for help. They realize they cannot save themselves.
Leading to step 6. God, in his mercy, sends a savior or a judge to deliver them from their enemies.
And finally, step 7. The people are granted rest. The crisis is over. But instead of maintaining their gratitude, the memory of the pain fades. The rest turns back into prosperity. And the entire doom loop starts all over again with rebellion.
It is a terrifying cycle.
Yeah.
And by recounting this meticulously, they aren't trying to make themselves feel worthless. They are trying to crack the code of their own destructive behavior to break the loop.
Yes.
They are publicly acknowledging God's infinite patience. The prayer repeatedly highlights this with phrases like, "Yet many years you put up with them." By outlining the data this way, they are actively reframing their current miserable distress. They are acknowledging that they aren't victims of a cruel, arbitrary God. They are experiencing the natural, inevitable consequence of their own stubbornness, what the text vividly describes as their withdrawing shoulder.
The metaphor of the withdrawn shoulder is brilliant. It describes an ox that stubbornly shrinks back from the yoke, refusing to pull the plow, yet still expects to be fed in the stall.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The Israelites wanted the immense benefits of the Promised Land without submitting to the responsibilities of the covenant. And this massive historical audit leads to a tragic gut punch of a conclusion in verse 36. After tracing centuries of history, they look at their current reality and pray, "Behold, we are servants today. In the large and rich land which you gave to our fathers to eat its fruit and its good, behold, we are servants in it."
Henry points out the crushing irony of this statement. These are freeborn Israelites, standing in the very land granted to them by the crown of heaven, but they are now holding it by base servitude to the Persian emperor.
It's just devastating.
It is. The land is still rich. It yields massive harvests. But the wealth is siphoned off to a foreign king to fund his distant wars. They possess external ownership of the dirt, but they live in absolute internal bondage.
This concept translates with terrifying accuracy to modern life. Consider how frequently we find ourselves living as servants in a rich land today.
Oh, it happens constantly. Think about the trajectory of a modern career. You grind for years, sacrificing sleep and relationships to get the promotion, to buy the massive house in the suburbs, to achieve this specific level of financial success you always dreamed of.
Right, you get the dream.
You finally arrive in your personal rich land. But because of a series of poor, incremental choices, perhaps taking on crushing amounts of debt to fund an unsustainable lifestyle, or developing a subtle gnawing addiction to status or alcohol to cope with the stress, or, completely destroying your marriage to climb the corporate ladder, you end up enslaved to the very life you spent a decade building.
You are surrounded by the trappings of wealth, but you possess zero actual freedom. You are a terrified vassal to your enormous mortgage. You are a servant to the endless notifications on your phone. You are a slave to the relentless expectations of your industry.
Yeah, you built a kingdom, but you're a prisoner inside of it.
Exactly. You are a miserable servant within the very life you dreamed of possessing. which demonstrates why the brutal historical confession of chapter 9 is so necessary. You cannot break that personal doom loop until you honestly map out your own history and identify the exact triggers where you keep making the pivot from prosperity into complacency and from complacency into crisis.
As we navigate this chapter, we encounter an obstacle to growth that we really must handle with extreme care, historical objectivity, and wisdom. Early in chapter 9, verse 2 mentions that the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers, or foreigners, prior to their confession.
Right, and we need to address this head on because a modern listener hears the phrase separated from foreigners and immediately recoils. Through a 21st century lens, it sounds inherently exclusionary, xenophobic, or like an ancient justification for extreme toxic nationalism.
Right, and our goal in this deep dive is not to project, endorse, or condemn modern political viewpoints regarding border policy, immigration, or nationalism. To extract the actual wisdom, we must look at this impartially within its strict ancient context.
Exactly. The Jewish people in 445 BC were not a dominant militaristic superpower trying to maintain racial purity or keep immigrants out of a thriving economy. They were a uniquely vulnerable, deeply traumatized, economically devastated community of refugees who had barely survived a century of exile.
They were just trying to hold on.
Yeah. Their primary existential threat was not military invasion, but total cultural and religious assimilation into the dominant polytheistic imperial culture of Persia and the surrounding warlords.
So the separation wasn't driven by ethnic hatred. It was a desperate measure for cultural and spiritual survival. Their historical doom loop, which they just spent 3 hours reciting, proved that whenever they intermingled deeply with the surrounding nations, they inevitably adopted the destructive, often brutal religious practices of those cultures, which is exactly what triggered their moral collapse and exile in the first place.
Exactly.
They were trying to preserve their unique ethical covenant with God in a sea of polytheism.
Precisely. The enduring, universal wisdom for the modern listener is not found in ethnic exclusion. The wisdom is found in a profound psychological principle. If you genuinely want to change your life and break your personal doom loop, you almost always have to separate yourself from the specific influences, the ingrained habits, or the social circles that constantly pull you back into your old destructive patterns.
It's the core principle of addiction recovery. If you are fighting to get sober, you cannot continue to hang out in the exact same bars with the exact same drinking buddies and expect to magically maintain your sobriety.
No, it's impossible.
Or if you are trying to desperately claw your way out of consumer debt, you are going to have to separate yourself from the friend group that constantly pressures you to go to expensive dinners, buy luxury items, or take vacations you can't afford.
Separation is frequently the necessary boundary required for inner healing. You have to be willing to create intentional, sometimes painful space between yourself and the environments that compromise your core values.
Let's turn this into a moment of reflection for you, the listener. Where in your life are you currently operating as a servant in a rich land? In what specific area do you project the appearance of external success, but deep down, you know you are experiencing internal bondage?
As a practical step this week, take a cue from the Levites in chapter 9 and actually map out your own historical cycle. Look back over the last 10 or 15 years of your life. What specific success triggers your slide into complacency? What are the warning signs of that transition?
Yeah, you have to look at the data.
Right. And more importantly, what are the external influences or habits you need to actively separate yourself from in order to break that cycle once and for all?
Because, as we transition to the final segment of our deep dive, we learn a harsh truth, a great historical realization, and a deeply emotional, tear-filled confession are completely useless if they do not result in changed behavior.
Totally useless.
You can cry all day, you can trace your psychological history all the way back to your childhood, you can identify all your triggers, but if you don't take concrete structural action, absolutely nothing changes. The sweeping emotional prayer of chapter 9 leads directly, logically, and necessarily to the ink and seals of chapter 10.
Yeah, chapter 10 provides us with the anatomy of a concrete commitment. Because of the exhaustive history they just recited and the doom loop they recognized, the people decide to formalize their repentance. They make what the text calls a sure covenant, and they draft it into a legally binding written document. Verse 1 details the signing process, noting that Nehemiah the governor signs his name first, followed by the priests, the Levites, and the chiefs of the people.
The physical act of signing this document is fascinating to me. They don't just stand up and offer a loud, emotional, verbal promise to, try harder next time.
No, they put it in writing.
They draft a contract. And Nehemiah's leadership here is exemplary. Matthew Henry observes that when leaders or nobles cordially espouse a cause and put their own skin in the game, the people naturally cleave to them. Nehemiah doesn't exempt himself from the rigorous new rules he is about to impose. He puts his own signature on the line first.
And the rest of the population follows suit. Verse 29 describes the gravity of their commitment, stating they entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law.
Okay, I have to stop you there because that phrase, entered into a curse and an oath, is another massive hurdle for a modern reader.
It sounds super intense, doesn't it?
It does. Modern people generally despise the idea of binding themselves permanently to anything. Our culture worships maximum flexibility. We want to keep our options open at all times, whether in careers, relationships, or geography. The idea of voluntarily invoking a curse on yourself if you fail to keep a religious or moral commitment sounds terrifying, primitive, and entirely anti-freedom.
It does sound severe to a modern ear, but if we dig into the deeper mechanics of human nature, we uncover a profound truth about what constitutes real freedom. True freedom is rarely found in having infinite choices. It is actually achieved by binding yourself to certain non-negotiables.
Wait, expand on that. How does binding yourself create freedom?
Well, if you want the ultimate freedom of sitting down at a piano and effortlessly playing a Chopin nocturne, you first have to bind yourself to thousands of hours of rigid, unglamorous daily practice. If you want the profound freedom and security of a deeply trusting, lifelong marriage, you have to voluntarily bind yourself to a strict vow of absolute fidelity, cutting off all other romantic options.
It's the concept of the Ulysses Pact. You are pre-committing.
Exactly.
By invoking a curse and an oath, the people of Jerusalem were essentially saying, we are intimately aware of our own weakness. We just spent 3 hours reciting our history of failure. We know that when times get tough or when we get too wealthy, we will want to abandon these rules. So we are going to make it unimaginably costly for us to fail.
They're burning the ships.
Yes. It's like freezing your credit cards in a block of ice when you're trying to stop impulse shopping. You intentionally make the destructive behavior difficult and painful.
Exactly. They are engineering their environment for success. And what is most impressive about this written covenant is its precision. They don't draft a vague document that says, we promise to generally be better people and love God more. They forensically target the exact specific structural areas where their society historically collapsed.
A doom loop triggers.
Exactly. The covenant tackles 4 main pillars. The first is boundaries, specifically regarding intermarriage. They legally commit to not giving their daughters to the surrounding peoples, nor taking foreign daughters for their sons.
As we discussed earlier, in their specific historical reality, this was the primary mechanism for protecting their homes and their theology from total cultural erosion by the polytheistic empire surrounding them.
Right.
The second pillar they target is time. They commit to strictly keeping the Sabbath. Verse 31 outlines the rule. They refuse to buy wares or grain from the surrounding peoples on the Sabbath day. Let's dig into the economic mechanics of this because it's wild.
The economic implications of the Sabbath rule in an ancient agrarian rebuilding society are just staggering. They are living in a vulnerable, impoverished city. The economic pressure to trade, to sell goods, and to grind out a living 7 days a week must have been immense.
The pressure must have been everywhere.
Oh, for sure. The surrounding nations didn't observe a Sabbath. They were ready to trade every day. By locking their gates and refusing to engage in commerce 1 day a week, the Jewish people were deliberately sabotaging their own maximum economic output.
They are looking at the math and saying, we're going to willingly take a 14% pay cut. They are pausing their economy to prioritize rest, worship, and human dignity.
It's radical.
It is a radical statement of trust. It challenges our modern 24/7 hustle culture so aggressively. Today, we are terrified to put our phones on Do Not Disturb for an hour, convinced that if we don't send that one extra email on Sunday afternoon, our career will collapse.
Yeah, we're completely driven by the fear of falling behind.
Right. Nehemiah's community looks at an empty city and says, no, a society that never stops working eventually burns out and forgets its soul. We trust God enough to stop.
The third pillar of the covenant focuses on compassion and economic justice. They formally promised to observe the 7th-year release, which meant foregoing the exaction of debts. To understand why this was revolutionary, you really have to understand the brutal mechanics of debt in the ancient Near East.
Break that down for us. What did debt look like in 445 BC?
In an agrarian economy, if a farmer had a bad harvest due to drought, he had to borrow grain to feed his family and seed his field for the next year. He would put up his land as collateral. If the next year is also bad, he would put up his children or himself as collateral.
That's horrifying.
It is. Because interest rates were notoriously exorbitant, compound interest would quickly overwhelm the principal. The farmer would lose his land, and he and his family would be forced into literal debt slavery to the wealthy elite. This created a massive, permanently impoverished underclass and a tiny group of ultra-wealthy land barons.
Which completely destroys the social fabric of a community.
Precisely. Henry points out that undoing the heavy burden was an act of mercy they had deeply neglected. Earlier in the book of Nehemiah, we see the wealthy Jewish nobles actively exploiting their poorer brothers through these exact predatory loans. By including the seventh-year release in the covenant, they are legally binding themselves to a rhythm of economic reset.
So every 7 years.
Every 7 years, the debts are wiped out, the collateral is returned. They are structurally forcing themselves to let go of their ruthless pursuit of what is legally owed to them in favor of preserving the community.
It is a structural, codified commitment to mercy. And finally, the fourth pillar targets their resources. They establish a new, recurring yearly tax of 1/3 of a shekel explicitly for the service of the house of God.
Yeah, Barnes notes that this was a self-imposed tax to ensure the temple didn't fall into disrepair.
Right. They establish a lottery system to dictate who brings the massive amounts of wood required to keep the altar fires burning, and they legally commit to bringing the first fruits of their harvests and their tithes. They conclude the entire dense legal document with one defining phrase: "We will not forsake the house of our God."
Through these resource commitments, they are directly challenging their own inherent consumerism and selfishness. They are publicly recognizing that the institutions that sustain the spiritual and moral soul of their community, the temple, the priesthood, the place of corporate worship, do not run on good intentions.
Right. They run on actual resources.
Yes, they require consistent, sacrificial material support. They are literally putting their money, their wood, and their grain where their mouth is.
Think about how deeply this applies to us today. We all harbor vague, generalized areas in our lives where we feel a low-level hum of guilt. We constantly say things to ourselves like, I really need to spend less time scrolling on my phone in the evenings, or I should probably be a more generous person, or I really need to figure out how to rest and not be so stressed about work.
We say those things all the time. But the problem, of course, is that vague intentions dissolve the moment we encounter actual stress. Vague guilt rarely, if ever, translates into lasting behavioral change.
Which is why the practice we draw from Chapter 10 is so vital. Think about how this applies to our modern psychology. Vague intentions disappear when we get stressed. But if you take a page out of Nehemiah's playbook and write down exactly what your boundary is, you shift from being a passive participant in your life to an active architect.
Yes, writing it down makes it real.
It does. We challenge you this week to turn your vague guilt into a literal written covenant. Define the exact measurable boundary you need to set. If your struggle is with time and burnout, write down your own specific Sabbath rule. I will put my laptop in a drawer from 6 p.m. Friday until Sunday morning.
That's a great one.
Or, if your struggle is with resources and consumerism, write down the exact dollar amount or percentage you're going to give away to a specific charity every single month. Write it down, sign your name to it, and hand it to a friend who has the authority to hold you accountable. Bind yourself to the freedom of a highly specific commitment.
It truly is the only way to ensure that the defensive walls you have spent so much energy building actually protect something of enduring value. When we step back and look at the entire sweeping journey of chapters 7 through 10, we are looking at an ancient, flawless masterclass in holistic restoration.
We really are.
It moves us sequentially from the grueling physical task of building a perimeter wall in Chapter 7 to the complex intellectual and spiritual task of understanding the truth in Chapter 8. It guides us through the volatile emotional terrain of weeping and redirects us toward the sustaining power of joy. It forces us into the deep, uncomfortable historical self-awareness of Chapter 9. And it culminates beautifully in the highly practical economic and structural commitments of signing a binding covenant in Chapter 10.
It provides a complete, timeless blueprint for rebuilding a broken life, a shattered family, or a fractured community from the ground up.
It really does. And it leaves us with a provocative, haunting thought to consider long after this deep dive ends. You can spend your entire life exhausting yourself to build the strongest, most impressive walls in the world. You can build impenetrable boundaries around your career. You can hoard wealth to protect your finances, and you can isolate your family from every conceivable external threat.
You can build the perfect fortress.
Exactly. You can engineer the perfect perimeter. But if you refuse to do the hard internal work of populating that protected space with the truth, with communal joy, with honest self-awareness, and with concrete, costly commitments to the things that actually matter, you are just guarding an empty city.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.